Hello, my name is David Lind. I'm an independent mental health services trainer and consultant, and I'm here working with the state of Missouri on this video. This video is about working with folks who are known as transition age youth, and some about the ACT-TAY teams that work with them here in the state of Missouri. We're hoping that this video will be helpful to you and your colleagues as you work with folks in this population. In this first part of the video, we want to spend some time today introducing some important concepts and developmental ideas about working with this population. So today, I'm joined with some very talented people from the state of Missouri. I want to take a minute to introduce them and thank them each for being on the panel with me. On my right, we have Lexi Thompson. On my right over here, Rosie Anderson Harper also. On my left, Tish Thomas over here. And on my immediate left, Mr. John Harper. Appreciate you all being with us and looking forward to this video today. Over the next few minutes, we're going to discuss some of the themes and ideas and concepts that are important about working with this population. Let's start with one of them. One of them is the developmental stage that young folks who are in transition age youth services might be at. Folks might be at the cusp of thinking about their career. They might be at the beginning of thinking about work, or maybe going or returning to school, furthering their education. There's a lot of things going on at that point that people tend to be struggling with. Another issue that emerges a lot is the development of a sense of what's around them. For example, you might think about a 38-year-old person and an 18-year-old person. If you were to approach a 38-year-old person and ask them, what do you think about work and your career? Well, you might get an answer that reflects, well, I work for my family. My career is to take care of folks. My income is to buy food or clothes. And they might have a much different sense about what a job and what income means in their life. Where an 18-year-old in transition age youth services, if you say, what do you think about work? What might first pop to their head might be maybe a job landscaping, or doing a summer painting job. And they might think about their job more as an immediate source of money, and the money more as an immediate source or ability to do something, as opposed to thinking about where it might go to a household or for others. So one of the first perspectives we want to think about with this group is the idea about what does the future mean? What does it mean if we start to ask people about jobs, careers, educations? Kind of wondering if any folks in the panel have any comments or any thoughts about that kind of perspective for transition age youth. Lexi.
In my experience working with transition age youth, they seem to have a much more distinct separation between their idea of a job and the rest of their lives. Career-minded people tend to look at their job as much more interwoven into their lives, whereas transition age youth can look at, I go to work, I get off work, and then I have a life.
So seeing it really much almost as a freestanding part, I'm hearing there, of their lives, and might treat it with sort of different respect within that concept. Great, so another consideration there to put in here is where does that fit within their whole life schema? Other thoughts from another panel about folks here?
Yes, Dave, I think that's an aspect that many professionals, they see and they understand, and sometimes that's frustrating for some of the professionals that are working with them because of all of the potential for them to access other programs, community college, technical and career education and those aspects. But I can understand that the transition age youth individual sees that as a major commitment and seeing themselves as only in that role for the rest of their lives rather than seeing that over a continuum and a developmental process. Because oftentimes I think many of them didn't see that in their own parents and family members or those that they've been around.
So seeing it almost as a separate entity and not fitting into sort of a flow, John, is what I'm hearing about where they might end up in going. And one of the things I want to pick up there as we sort of move to the next section about this, John, you raised the interesting idea about thinking about different ideas. And one of the things from my experience, and I'd like to hear from some of your experiences too, is that a lot of times folks will talk to me about, well, I'm working with some folks on their education or on their career path, and all of a sudden Tuesday we had this plan. I talked to them on Thursday and they had this plan, and I talked to them the next Monday and they had a third plan. And I think one of the challenges is often, how do we remind ourselves of who it is we're working with? Are we working with somebody who's had some time to maybe give some seasoning and some thought to what they want to do? Or are we working with somebody who might be almost trying out concepts in their mind and how it feels and shifting around almost? Almost a sense that this population, if you dare say it, changes their mind pretty regularly. Thoughts from that from anybody on the panel?
I think
Rosie?
that's really important when talk about the development of the young adults, about their brain and the development of the brain, because they do, I think, they have lots of options, lots of choices, lots of information, and it's hard for them to stay focused. Also, you know, we are in a world where you don't stay as focused on one thing. You have many, many things going on. You have all this electronics, and so there is this movement, I think, more than what we see in older adults. And so I think that's a challenge in working with adolescents is they do change their minds a lot. They do have a lot of choice, options, information. So helping them stay focused on one plan, I don't know, how that seems like a struggle.
You know, I think it's a wonderful reflection you just made, where people are jumping around, and what do we expect from the folks working on an ACT-A team to say, I can stay with this jumping around, or I can understand this jumping around, and I can create some allowance or space for it. Any thoughts about how that might work, or what that might look like in working with folks?
To focus on the importance of their peers in their lives, in addition to all the social media. This is a generation that has grown up with instant gratification, instant information, and their peers are very important, but sometimes their peers are maybe miles away, and their experiences are different from what they're living with at that moment. So dealing with them from a person-centered sense of where are they in that moment, who are their influences, and trying to be as person-centered and flexible as possible with the treatment approaches, because if you look at the stages of change and other evidence-based practices, they all need to be very fluid to adapt to that individual.
So one of the challenges might be, if I'm a supported employment and education specialist and I'm working with somebody who's 18 and maybe changing their mind a lot, I might not want to think about, is this a statement that they're not motivated or not serious about following through with this? And I'm wondering if there might be some ideas or strategies that we might recommend for somebody so that they treat this more in the sort of flexible way that you were describing, as opposed to sort of a judgmental way. Lexi, any thoughts about that?
Yeah, related to what Tish had to say and what Rosie also said about the access to information that youth have that maybe we haven't seen before in our society. It has always been an essential part of the developmental process to try on different identities at the transition age stage. So I think we're seeing that, plus access to more different types of identities. They have access to information. So I think we would maybe even see changing minds more rapidly because they have so much access to different, they can see different things, and they can see the way different people live all across the world.
Go ahead, Jim.
David, I think also, you know, the aspect or thing you need to consider with this is that you might want to, as a professional, acknowledge that the person's processing that information. They're bringing in they're processing information they might be bringing in from their peers, from other people in the general press and other sources. So I think, you know, it's something to acknowledge, something to celebrate, but also help those individuals process what that information might be. What are those considerations? Very oftentimes, I think that we don't look at those common themes with the individual. We see it as a professional, very face valid. They want to work as a meat cutter, or they want to work in a coffee shop. Well, what's common about that? It's the service industry. You're interacting with customers, perhaps. Maybe that's what the person's really trying to communicate there. Those are the pieces that sometimes as professionals in the behavioral health field, and for that matter, sometimes in the vocational rehabilitation field, we don't necessarily lock into that and find that and communicate that theme back to the individual, help be their mirror in that conversation.
So one of the things I'm hearing, and putting those two together, I'm hearing Lexi talk about you can have sort of almost multiple careers to try on pretty quickly because of social media and broad social relationships. I grew up in a small town in northern New Hampshire. It meant you thought about what are the 4 jobs in this town. But what I'm hearing you say is I can be in Missouri and think about what's in Arizona or what's in Maine, and I could think about those. And I'm also hearing you say, John, that if we're going to let people have some choices and really honor that, we might need to work a little bit differently with the choices. It might not be a meat cutter or a baker, but it might be I have customer service, and so sometimes we might need to listen with our further back lens instead of our zoom in lens as we work with folks.
And as you said, David, not to see it as being unmotivated, because I think sometimes it is perceived that way, is that, oh, that 18-year-old seems unmotivated, but it may be that they're experimenting, and to reframe it as the the person working with the individual to reframe it so that this is normal child development, this is normal adult development, and they're trying on new things rather than, they seem a little unmotivated.
You know, Rosie, that description, I think, is part of exactly what we're going to ask people who work in these teams to sort of suspend their judgment and try to go back to that period. I don't know if you all can remember, but I think back to all the things that I thought I wanted to do. I was sure I wanted to be an astronaut. I was sure I wanted to be an aeronautical engineer. I was sure that I wanted to be a forester. That a lot of things go through phases at that point, and none of them seem to be, as you said, should be judged, but should be accepted as the process that's going on. I'd like to bring up another theme that I've heard a few of you raise, and I don't think it's a coincidence, and that's the idea of peers. I heard a few of you mention they have a lot of contact with their peers, they think in peers. We know with this group also that there's a lot of connection to substance use sometimes in peers and who they hang out with. I'd just kind of like to throw out a concept and maybe have you all respond to it. That concept is, what does the word peer mean to somebody who's, let's say, 17 instead of somebody who's 42? This was a big learning curve for me. I've worked a lot in, excuse the term, adult mental health services, where the definition of peer has always been sort of embraced as someone who has a lived experience of a mental illness, who shares or uses that in some structured, intentional way to be helpful with other folks in their recovery process. What happens to these 17 or 18-year-old, 19-year-old folks if we say, we'd like to meet some of your peers? Who do you think are their peers, and what's different about them?
Well, they're going to be their friends, not necessarily other people their age that are receiving services at that mental health center. They're not going to be people who have maybe a substance use problem. It's going to be their friends or their social network, per se. So it's a totally different concept with people in that age group, and therapists need to acknowledge that. And they don't look at themselves as a person with a disability either. They don't look at their diagnosis or whatever they're receiving services for as a disabling condition. So that's another thing that people need to be aware of.
Well, I think, Tish, you're dead on with that, is that they don't let their diagnosis define them in a group at all. They are part of their community, whatever that community might be, in regard to, with respect to their own recreational activities. If they're rock climbers, they're rock climbers. If they're, media buffs and doing film, that's what they do. Or the music scene, that's what they do. And oh, by the way, they go to this place for some help occasionally.
Mm-hmm.
So you two both raised some important points. Among them, peers are a large, diverse group of people they spend a lot of time with. And for this group, they also actually find the idea of some identity and some emerging sense of who they are amongst their peers at different times. And I guess I would like to add another concept to that you just mentioned, which is the idea, am I somebody with a disability? And I think one of the things that we, maybe for better or for worse, sometimes an adult service has done is really work with folks to acknowledge, yes, you have a mental illness, yes, you have a disabling condition. And in some cases, though, the evidence doesn't always support this. Some people believe that you really can't provide treatment until somebody sort of does the acceptance, I do have this illness, I'm ready to be treated. And this group seems to make us think that that's not such a good model. One of the things that we try to do with this group is emphasize ability, not disability. We try to emphasize people's ability to provide in the community, not depend on the community. And we try to emphasize people being independent with themselves, but balancing that with some dependence on others. And thinking about all that, I'm wondering about the idea about when we start talking about maybe taking medications, and I want to go back to your point. That I'd like to hear if y'all have some thoughts about what might happen or what might be going through the mind of a 17-year-old or a 16-year-old when they're approached and somebody says, well, what we now know is you have a disabling and we're expecting you to take this medication for the rest of your life. How might that sound or be different to a 16, 17-year-old? Thoughts on that?
They'll be resistant to that. They wouldn't like that thought of doing that. But then again, it can also be very individual. And that's the other thing, that's the other challenge for a clinician, is to be person-centered, flexible. But I have a family member who resisted that, and as a young adult, transition age adult. and led that family member down a road that was not very good. So, but now he is willing to do this. He sees the right thing. So, but a lot of transition age youth are like, I don't know about that. Right, let's try something else. What are my options? And they'll do research. They will get online and they'll do their own research on these things. So you have to acknowledge that too, that they're gonna go on the path that they think, I like what that site said, or I like what that blogger said, or whatever. Talk to their peers.
And as part of the assertive community treatment training for physicians, we've been, as part of the NIMH study and others, we're learning that it's probably not correct to prescribe large doses of medication, multiple medications early.
Yes.
Really what we're talking about is first deciding are medications necessary, and then in lower doses, then deciding if we need to move it up. So I think part of the assertive community treatment transition age youth training for physicians and the team is to think about lower doses, and even if medications are necessary. And I think that's been an important change in the thinking about how to treat mental illness. You don't just start out with a large dose of meds. And then that leaves it open that over time, maybe things will change. Let's see how this works. Let's try this, that person-centered approach that Tish mentioned, rather than, oh, this is the protocol and you're going to get this.
David, I also think another piece that people working in an ACT team need to consider, and I look at it from my perspective of actually being a VR counselor that's been in the field, going and driving hundreds of miles over the course of a week to see individuals that I'm serving, but also see them in their family environment, is that these transition age youth, I think that it's what they perceive and how they perceive others having taken medication. So if at a very young age you're being prescribed this, you have to put yourself in the frame of mind what they see their grandparents and family members that maybe have gone through major illnesses, and what does that really mean to them, and painting them into that identity of that's who they are. So consider that, and maybe look at that history that they have as individuals.
So I'm hearing some themes come together here about decision making, who's important within their lives, sort of the idea of acceptance, denial. And I'm also hearing the theme that you mentioned, Rosie, about not really starting heavy with medications. And maybe we'd think that way about some treatments too, starting with what is contextual. And by contextual, I mean what fits with where the person is at that point, but also what fits with what their idea is of sort of medium range, as opposed to you might need to take this, let's try this, from what I heard, let's try this for 3 or 4 weeks and see what happens. And I guess the one piece I would add to this conversation is that we know that the combination of all these factors actually have a lot to do with people's willingness to use medications effectively. We don't know that everybody needs medications. We do know it's helpful for some people. But we also can think about how do we engage in a conversation that includes a person's side effects, a person's view of their long-term future, a person's understanding of if they do or do not have something going on that medications might help with. And then the other piece that seems to be really important from our research that you mentioned is knowing that young adults actually in their profiles are more sensitive to medication side effects than older adults. So that somebody who is an older adult might experience a small weight gain over several months, as a young adult might experience a rapid weight gain over a few weeks. And for some folks, that might be right going to the core of their identity. I remember one young man in our focus group who said, I stopped taking that meds after 2 weeks. I'd gained 5 pounds. I couldn't board and I couldn't chick anymore, so I had to stop. Took me about 10 minutes to understand what he was telling me. But I think that presents the idea of a different perspective on medication and medication side effects.
I think it's also important what you said about resiliency, so that all of this is done in that context of people are resilient, you can learn new things, you can learn new coping mechanisms, you can learn new behaviors, you can practice it, we'll support you in that, so that it's not you have an illness, it's done, your life's over, which I think previously was a message that we gave to people 40 years ago. That's not the message anymore. Now the message, all this is done in that context of you can learn to be resilient. We can teach you those skills. Let's go.